What would your life look like if after sunset, the world simply stopped? Tonight, we'll explore the long and surprisingly dramatic history of the light bulb, a story filled with obsessive inventors, corporate conspiracies, and a bitter war between two visions of the future. It's a history that touches something most of us never think about, which is how profoundly a single object reshaped the way humans live, work, sleep, and dream. So if you're already lying down, settled into your bed, or stretched out on the couch, let yourself get comfortable. There's no rush here. Just a good story waiting to unfold, slowly in the dark. Chapter 1. The World in Darkness. There is something worth pausing on before we get to Edison and his famous bulb, before the laboratories and the patents and the arguments about who really invented what. There is something worth imagining first. Close your eyes for a moment and think about your home after sunset, but remove every electric light from the picture. Remove the lamp on the nightstand, the glow of the television, the soft blue light seeping under the bathroom door. Remove even the faint orange haze of the city coming in through the curtains. Now, you are closer to understanding what most of human history actually felt like once the sun went down. For thousands of years, the primary technology humans used to push back the dark was fire. That is not a metaphor. It was quite literally fire in one form or another, carried inside containers of animal fat or plant oil, burning on wicks made of twisted fiber, producing light that was dim, unstable, and deeply inconvenient. The most common source of artificial light for ordinary people across most of human history was the tallow candle. And tallow, if you are not familiar with it, is rendered animal fat, usually from cattle or sheep. It was cheap, which is why it was so widespread. But it came with a set of problems that people today rarely think about. Tallow candles smelled. They smelled of burning fat, which is a specific kind of smell that sits somewhere between a kitchen and something less pleasant. They also dripped constantly, leaving waxy residue on furniture, on clothes, on floors. They produced soot. They flickered in the slightest draught, and perhaps most importantly, they were genuine and ever-present fire hazard in homes built almost entirely of wood. City fires in the pre-electric era were not rare events. They were an accepted feature of urban life. London burned in 1966, or countless smaller towns and neighborhoods burned in ways history barely recorded. The candle sitting on the table next to the sleeping child was not a romantic detail. It was a risk that everyone simply lived with because there was no alternative. Wealthier households turned to whale oil as a step up from tallow. Whale oil burned cleaner, produced a steadier and brighter flame, and smelled somewhat less offensive. But the demand for it across Europe and North America especially was staggering, and it drove the whaling industry to extraordinary and brutal lengths. Ships would spend years at sea hunting sperm whales in particular, whose oil was considered the finest available. By the mid-1800s, certain whale populations had been reduced so severely that some historians and ecologists believed the whaling industry was on a clear path toward collapsing its own supply. The light in a wealthy Victorian parlor had in a very real sense been purchased at the cost of entire ecosystems. It is a strange thought to sit with. Then came gas. If you walked through a major European or American city in the first half of the 19th century, you would have noticed, sometime around the 1820s or 1830s, a change beginning to happen on the streets. Gas lamps were being installed along main avenues, fed by underground pipes carrying coal gas from central production facilities. London began experimenting with gas street lighting around 1807, and by the middle of the century, it had spread widely through the wealthier neighborhoods of many cities. It was, by the standards of the time, miraculous. A steady, reasonably bright flame that did not need to be individually lit from a candle, that burned without the sputtering of a tallow wick. But gaslighting was not the comfortable solution it might sound like. Coal gas is flammable, which means the pipes that carried it, the fittings that connected it, the valves that controlled it, all of them were potential sources of catastrophe. Gas leaks were common. Explosions happened. Fires started. And even without a dramatic accident, simply being in a gaslit room for an extended period came with its own quiet costs. The combustion produced heat, significant heat, enough that gaslit theaters and ballrooms became genuinely uncomfortable on warm evenings. It produced carbon monoxide and other byproducts of combustion that simply accumulated in enclosed spaces. The walls of gaslit rooms turned yellow and gray over time. The lungs of people who spent their lives in gaslit environments accumulated soot in ways that only became understood much later. It was better than candles, certainly, but it was not clean, and it was not safe, and everyone who used it knew it on some level. What all of this points toward, though, is something that goes beyond the inconvenience of smell or soot or the occasional explosion. What it points toward is the profound and almost incomprehensible cost of light itself in the pre-electric world. There is a calculation that some economic historians have done, trying to translate the actual price of illumination across different eras into comparable modern terms. The results are striking. In ancient Babylon, producing the equivalent of 1 hour of decent reading light from a sesame oil lamp cost the average worker several days of wages. By the time of 18th century England, a tallow candle had brought that cost down considerably. But lighting a single modest room for an evening still represented a meaningful portion of a working family's budget. Light was not a free and invisible feature of domestic life. It was a commodity, and an expensive one, and families made careful decisions about how much of it they could afford. What this meant, practically, was that for the vast majority of people throughout history, the working day ended when the sun went down. Not because people were lazy or lacked ambition, but because continuing to work after dark was a luxury that most families simply could not afford. The farmer, the seamstress, the cobbler, the clerk, all of them organized their lives around daylight. Night was not a canvas for productivity or entertainment. Night was for sleeping or for sitting in near darkness, waiting for morning. The rhythm of human life was, for millennia, fundamentally different from anything we would recognize today, shaped not by choice, but by the simple, hard economics of fire. Chapter 2. The True Pioneers. Before Edison, before Swan, before anyone whose name made it into the history books most of us were handed in school, there was a man standing in a darkened room in London, watching something extraordinary happen. His name was Humphrey Davy, and in the year 1802, he did something that no human being had ever done before. He made electricity glow. Davy was a chemist, and a brilliant one, the kind of mind that seemed to find pleasure in pushing things past their known limits. He had been experimenting with a device called a voltaic pile, which was essentially an early battery, and he connected 2 charcoal rods to it. When the tips of those rods were brought close together, an arc of electric light leapt between them, fierce and white and almost painful to look at. It was the arc lamp, and it was, in a word, spectacular. But spectacular is not the same as useful. The light Davy had created was something closer to a small captured sun than a candle you could sit beside to read a letter. It was blinding, unsteady, and extraordinarily hungry for energy. The charcoal rods burned away quickly, meaning someone had to constantly adjust and replace them just to keep the light going. And the light itself, that violent arc, was far too intense for any room a person might actually want to inhabit. You could not put one of these in your parlor. You could not set one beside your bed. It was theatrical, almost violent in its brightness, something you might use to illuminate a lighthouse or a public square. And indeed, arc lamps would eventually find that kind of use in the streets of Paris and London, in theaters and train stations. But the dream of bringing soft, manageable electric light into the home, that dream was still a very long way away. What Davy had done, though, was arguably more important than any immediate practical application. He had proved a principle. Electricity could produce light. That sounds simple now, but at the time it was genuinely astonishing. A door opening onto a corridor that no one had known existed. After Davy, inventors and scientists across Europe and America began walking down that corridor, groping in the dark, trying to find the door at the other end. And very quickly, they all ran into the same wall. The problem was oxygen. It sounds almost too simple. But the obstacle that stood between Davy's blinding arc and a gentle light bulb you could leave burning on a table was essentially this. If you have a thin material, a wire, a thread, a filament of almost anything, and you heat it until it glows, it does not stay glowing for long. It burns. Combustion happens the moment something hot meets the oxygen in the air around it, and a glowing filament is hot enough to combust almost instantly. The filament simply eats itself. The solution, at least in theory, was straightforward. Remove the oxygen, enclose the filament in a glass container, and pump the air out, creating a vacuum. Without oxygen, the filament cannot burn. It can glow and glow and glow. The problem was that in the early and middle parts of the 19th century, doing that was extraordinarily difficult. Vacuum pumps existed, but they were crude, slow, and imprecise. They could remove some of the air from a glass vessel, but not enough. There was always a little oxygen left behind, just enough to eventually destroy the filament, sometimes in minutes, sometimes in seconds. The glass itself was hard to work with at that scale, hard to seal properly, hard to shape around the delicate structure of the filament without breaking everything. The materials available for filaments were limited, and most of them either burned too quickly or required so much electricity to heat that the whole enterprise became impractical. So for decades, dozens of men across multiple countries sat with this problem. They made progress in small, frustrating increments. They tried different filament materials, different glass shapes, different pumping methods. And most of them, when they got close, encountered the same thing, a brief, beautiful glow, and then nothing. But there is one story tucked inside this era that deserves a moment of its own. And it is a strange one, unresolved even now, the kind of story that history books often leave out because it does not fit neatly into the official narrative. His name was Heinrich Goebel, a German watchmaker who had emigrated to New York in the 1840s. He was a careful, precise man, trained in the patient craft of small mechanisms. And he claimed years later that sometime in the 1850s he had built a working incandescent light bulb in his workshop. Not an arc lamp, a true incandescent bulb, a glowing filament enclosed in glass, producing steady, usable light. According to Goebel, the filament he used was carbonized bamboo, and the glass vessel was a perfume bottle, the kind you could buy cheaply in any city market. He said he pumped out as much air as he could with the equipment he had, sealed it, connected it to a battery, and watched it glow. He claimed it burned for hours. Now, the timing of this claim matters enormously, because if Goebel is to be believed, he achieved this decades before Edison's famous 1879 demonstration. And the reason the claim is complicated is that Goebel only really came forward with his account after Edison's success had already made the subject famous and legally valuable. There were patent disputes, and Goebel's story became useful to Edison's rivals who wanted to challenge the patents. Some historians have been skeptical, pointing to the convenient timing. Others have found the details of his account surprisingly plausible, arguing that a skilled craftsman with the right intuition might genuinely have stumbled onto something real without having any means to scale it, patent it, or tell the world. What we know for certain is that Goebel's supposed bulbs were never preserved, never independently verified at the time they were allegedly made, and that the man himself that died before the legal cases involving his name were fully resolved. So his story exists in a kind of historical limbo, plausible, unproven, and quietly fascinating. A reminder that the history of invention is almost never as clean as the statues and textbooks suggest. What all of these early pioneers shared, from Davy with his blinding arc to the quiet, unverifiable workshop of a German watchmaker in Manhattan, was a sense that the thing they were reaching for was real. It existed. The glow was possible. They just had not yet found the combination of materials, techniques, and engineering that would make it last. Chapter 3. The Race for Incandescence and the British Rival. While Humphrey Davy's arc lamp had proven that electricity could produce light, it had also made one thing painfully clear. Producing light was easy. Producing useful light, light that could sit quietly in a room, without blinding everyone, without burning out in minutes, without demanding the power of a small factory just to stay alive. That was an entirely different problem. And through the middle decades of the 1800s, scientists across Europe and America were quietly, stubbornly, obsessively trying to solve it. The name most people never hear in this story is Joseph Swan. He was an English chemist and physicist working out of Newcastle. A quiet and methodical man who had been experimenting with incandescent light since the early 1850s. That's not a typo. Swan had been at this for nearly 3 decades before the moment the history books usually point to. He understood the basic principle well enough. If you pass electricity through a thin material, it resists the current, heats up, and glows. The question was always how to make that glow last longer than a few flickering seconds. Swan worked with carbonized paper filaments, threading them carefully into glass bulbs and trying to remove as much air as possible from the inside. Oxygen, as he knew, was the enemy. It reacted with the hot filament and destroyed it almost instantly. The problem in Swan's early years was that the vacuum pumps of his time simply weren't good enough. They left too much air behind, and his filaments burned away before they had a chance to prove themselves. He made progress. He showed results to small audiences, and then he ran into those same walls again and again. The technology of the era wasn't quite ready for the idea he was carrying. By the late 1870s, though, vacuum pump technology had improved considerably, thanks in part to work done by a German physicist named Hermann Sprengel. And Swan returned to his experiments with new tools and renewed focus. In 1878 and into early 1879, he demonstrated a working incandescent light bulb to audiences in Newcastle. It glowed. It lasted. People who were there described the experience with something close to wonder. Here was a soft, steady electric light, sitting inside a glass bulb, illuminating a room without flame, without smoke, without the constant danger of setting something on fire. But Swan's design had a real limitation, one that would matter enormously. His filaments were thick, and thick filaments require a great deal of electrical current to heat up to the point of glowing. That meant that Swan's bulbs, impressive as they were not practical for widespread use. The infrastructure simply didn't exist to deliver that much electricity to ordinary homes. Swan knew how to make light. He hadn't yet figured out how to make it efficient enough for the world to actually use. Across the Atlantic, a different kind of man was watching all of this very closely. Thomas Edison is one of those figures in history who has become so large in the popular imagination that the actual story of what he did and didn't do has gotten a little blurry. The legend says he invented the light bulb. The more accurate version is considerably more interesting. Edison was not the first. He was, by some counts, at least the 23rd. Historians who have looked carefully at the record have found something like 22 inventors who created working versions of incandescent light bulbs before Edison filed his most famous patent. Some of these were serious scientists who came genuinely close to a practical solution. Others were inventors who solved one piece of the puzzle without quite assembling the whole picture. Swan was among them, and arguably the closest. But there were others too, scattered across England, Germany, Canada, and the United States, each contributing something to the long, slow accumulation of knowledge that made the modern light bulb possible. What Edison contributed was not the idea, and not even the first working version. What he contributed was a kind of relentless, systematic perfectionism aimed at a very specific goal. Not just making a bulb that glowed, but making a bulb that could be the centerpiece of an entire electrical system that could actually be sold to the world. Edison's laboratory in Menlo Park, New Jersey, was almost more like a factory of ideas than a traditional inventor's workshop. He had a team, resources, and a methodology that was almost industrial in its ambition. And when he turned his attention to the filament problem, he approached it with a thoroughness that was, by any measure, extraordinary. He tested more than 6,000 different materials. Plant fibers, grasses, threads, hairs, wood, cork, and things that don't easily fit into any single category. He sent requests to collectors and botanists around the world, asking for samples of plant materials from places as distant as the Amazon and Southeast Asia. He was looking for something that would carbonize well, resist the current with exactly the right amount of opposition, and glow brightly without burning out too quickly. The answer, when it finally came, arrived from Japan. Carbonized bamboo, specifically a variety from the Kyoto region, turned out to possess almost exactly the properties Edison had been searching for. It was thin enough to resist current efficiently, durable enough to last, and flexible enough to shape into the delicate loops his bulbs required. In October of 1879, after testing, failing, and testing again across months of quiet obsession, Edison's team produced a bulb with a carbonized bamboo filament that burned for over 13 hours. Later versions lasted much longer. He was not the first to make a light bulb, but he may have been the first to make one that the world could actually live with. And that difference quiet as it sounds, would change almost everything that came after. Chapter 4: The War of the Currents. By 1882, Thomas Edison had already done something remarkable. He hadn't just invented a light bulb. He had invented a world around it. On Pearl Street, in Lower Manhattan, he built the first commercial power station in history, a building filled with massive generators he called jumbos, each one rumbling and hissing, pushing electricity through copper cables buried beneath the cobblestones of New York City. On September 4th of that year, Edison himself stood inside the offices of a financier named J.P. Morgan and flipped a switch. 85 buildings lit up. It was, by any measure, one of the most consequential moments of the 19th century. But there was a quiet problem buried inside that triumph, a technical limitation that Edison either didn't fully appreciate or perhaps refused to acknowledge. His system ran on a direct current, what we call DC. Electricity flows in one direction, steady and constant, like water pushed through a pipe. It works beautifully, but only up to a point. With the technology available at the time, direct current could only travel about a mile before it lost so much energy that it became useless. That meant that to power a city, you would need a power station every mile or so. To power a country, you would need hundreds, maybe thousands of them. Edison's vision of illuminating the world was, in a very real sense, limited by the physics of his own preferred system. And then, from across the Atlantic, came a solution he did not want. Nikola Tesla arrived in the United States in 1884, a young Serbian engineer with almost no money and an extraordinary mind. He had worked briefly for Edison's company in Europe, and now he came to work for Edison directly in New York. By most accounts, Tesla was brilliant, obsessive, and completely convinced that alternating current, AC, was the future of electricity. In alternating current, the flow of electricity reverses direction many times per second, which sounds counterintuitive. But this property allows the voltage to be stepped up and down using a device called a transformer. And that single capability changes everything. High voltage loses far less energy over long distances. With AC, you could build one power station and send electricity not just down the street, but across entire states, across mountains, over rivers, to places Edison's cables could never reach. Tesla tried to convince Edison of this. According to the stories that have been passed down, Edison either dismissed the idea or simply wasn't interested. The two men eventually parted ways, and Tesla went to work with a businessman named George Westinghouse, who understood immediately what alternating current could mean commercially. Westinghouse began building his own power systems, his own infrastructure, his own future. And suddenly, Edison had a rival. What followed is one of the stranger chapters in the history of technology, something that gets called, with a certain dramatic flair, the War of the Currents. And it was a war, though it was fought not with weapons but with demonstrations, newspaper stories, and something closer to theater than to science. Edison was not a man who accepted competition gracefully. He had built something enormous, invested enormous amounts of money and reputation into direct current, and he was not prepared to watch alternating current quietly replace it. So he did something that, looking back, feels almost surreal. He began a public campaign not to improve his own technology, but to make people afraid of the other one. His argument was simple and brutal. Alternating current, because it operates at higher voltages, is more dangerous. And he was not entirely wrong about that. High voltage AC can kill quickly if mishandled, But Edison didn't present this as a nuanced engineering concern. He turned it into a spectacle. He and his associates began hosting public demonstrations where animals, usually dogs and calves obtained from local sources, were electrocuted using Westinghouse's alternating current. The point was visceral and deliberate. Look what this electricity does. This is what Westinghouse wants to bring into your home. There is a word that crept into the popular vocabulary around this time, partly because of Edison's campaign. When a man named Harold Brown, who had close ties to Edison's laboratory, developed the first electric chair for the state of New York, the method of execution used was alternating current. Edison reportedly wanted the public to start calling electrocution being Westinghoused. The idea was to make the name of his rival synonymous with death. It didn't entirely work, but the attempt tells you something about how far Edison was willing to go. The most famous and heartbreaking episode associated with this period, though it happened a few years later in 1903, was the electrocution of an elephant named Topsy at Coney Island. Topsy had killed 3 men, one of whom had apparently tried to feed her a lit cigarette, and the decision was made to put her down. The method chosen was electrocution, and Edison's company filmed the event. Whether Edison himself orchestrated this as propaganda by that point is debated by historians, but the film existed and it circulated, and it became part of the strange and dark mythology of this era. What is remarkable in the end is that the war was decided not by fear, but by scale. The 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, a vast and luminous event that drew millions of visitors, was lit entirely by Westinghouse using alternating current. The visual effect was staggering. People who had never seen electric light before stood in a city blazing white after dark. And the contract to harness the power of Niagara Falls, awarded that same decade, went to Westinghouse as well. The falls sent alternating current across the region, and the argument was settled. Edison lost the technical debate. But the world he helped build, the world of switches and stations and wires running beneath city streets, that world remained. It just ran on someone else's current. Chapter 5. The Dominance of Tungsten. Even after all the drama of the current wars had settled, after Edison's name had become synonymous with the light bulb and electricity had begun threading itself through the walls of homes and factories, there was still a quiet, persistent problem that nobody had truly solved. The light bulb worked, but it didn't work well enough. Not yet. Edison's carbonized bamboo filament, the one he had arrived at after testing thousands of materials from across the world, was a genuine achievement. It glowed. It lasted longer than anything before it, and it made the idea of electric light feel real and possible for ordinary people. Swan's bulbs, developed across the Atlantic with similar ambition, had the same essential character. They burned, they dimmed, and eventually they darkened from the inside, the glass slowly clouding over as tiny particles from the filament deposited themselves on the inner surface, stealing the light bit by bit until the bulb became more shadow than illumination. It was a little like watching someone slowly go blind. You'd notice it only when you compared what the bulb looked like the day you first switched it on to what it looked like a few weeks later. A brownish film creeping inward from the top, and then, one unremarkable evening, the filament would simply give out. The average lifespan of these early bulbs was somewhere around a few hundred hours, though the exact number varied depending on who made them and how carefully they were used. For a household that kept lamps burning through the evening, that meant replacing bulbs with uncomfortable regularity. The promise of electric light was real, but the inconvenience was also real. Engineers and scientists understood that the filament itself was the weak point. Carbon, for all its usefulness, was fragile. It was brittle. It evaporated slowly under the heat of its own glow, and that evaporation was precisely what caused the glass to darken. The question that lingered was whether there existed a better material, something that could withstand enormous heat, something that would glow brightly without slowly destroying itself. Tungsten had long been considered a candidate. It has the highest melting point of any metal, somewhere around 3,400 degrees Celsius, which means it can glow at extraordinarily high temperatures without liquefying. Hotter filament meant brighter light. In theory, tungsten was the perfect solution. In practice, it was an almost impossible material to work with. The problem was that tungsten in its natural state is extraordinarily brittle. It shatters. You cannot draw it into fine wires the way you can with copper or gold. Early attempts to use tungsten in light bulbs resulted in filaments that snapped almost immediately, unable to survive even the gentle vibrations of ordinary handling. The material seemed to resist every effort to shape it. For years, this dead end frustrated the industry. Everyone could see the answer, but no one could reach it. That changed in 1910, when a chemist at General Electric named William Coolidge found a way through. Coolidge's approach was methodical and patient, the kind of scientific work that doesn't make for dramatic storytelling, but quietly changes everything. He discovered that by processing tungsten powder under very specific conditions, combining heat and pressure and careful mechanical working over multiple stages, he could produce a form of tungsten that was ductile, flexible, something you could actually draw into a thin, fine wire without it crumbling apart. It was not a single eureka moment, but rather the result of years of incremental experimentation, of failure and adjustment and trying again. The filaments that resulted from Coolidge's process were remarkable. They lasted not hundreds of hours, but thousands. They burned brighter. They were more consistent. And because they could tolerate such extreme temperatures, they made more efficient use of the electrical energy passing through them. The bulb that most people picture when they think of the 20th century, that warm, rounded shape with the delicate coiled wire glowing amber inside, is essentially the child of Coolidge's tungsten work. General Electric patented the process, and within a few years, carbon filaments had been almost entirely replaced. The bamboo and the cellulose, the materials Edison had traveled figuratively across the world to find, quietly stepped aside. But there remained one more problem, and it took another mind to solve it. Even with tungsten, the darkening of the glass hadn't entirely disappeared. The filament still slowly evaporated at the atomic level, still released particles that drifted and settled. The vacuum inside the bulb, which had been the standard approach since the earliest days of incandescent design, couldn't prevent this entirely. A vacuum removes oxygen, which is good, because oxygen would cause the filament to burn and oxidize almost instantly. But a vacuum alone doesn't stop tungsten from gradually sublimating, from transitioning directly from solid to vapor under intense heat. Irving Langmuir, another scientist working at General Electric in roughly the same era, approached this problem with a different kind of intuition. His insight was to introduce a small amount of inert gas into the bulb, specifically argon. Inert gases don't react with anything. They won't oxidize the filament. They won't combust. They simply exist inside the glass, calm and indifferent. but their presence changes the physical behavior of the evaporating tungsten particles. Instead of drifting freely across the empty space and settling on the glass, the particles collide with the argon molecules and are, to a significant degree, redirected back toward the filament. The glass stays clearer, the light stays brighter for longer. Langmuir would later receive a Nobel Prize in chemistry, though for a broader body of surface chemistry work rather than this specific contribution. But the argon-filled bulb became the standard almost immediately after his work demonstrated its advantages. The combination of Coolidge's ductile tungsten filament and Langmuir's inert gas filling gave the world a light bulb that was genuinely reliable, genuinely long-lasting, genuinely bright. By the 1920s, the modern incandescent bulb was essentially complete. The science had arrived at something stable, something that worked, and for a few decades, it seemed as though the long struggle to keep a light burning through the night had finally found its answer. Chapter 6: The Dark Side of the Light. There is a particular kind of darkness that has nothing to do with the absence of light. It is the darkness that lives inside a boardroom, behind closed doors, spoken in quiet voices by men in expensive suits. And in 1924, that kind of darkness gathered in Geneva, Switzerland, dressed itself up as progress, and quietly changed the world in a way most people still don't fully know about. By the early 1920s, the light bulb had become genuinely impressive. Engineers, building on the work of Coolidge and Langmuir and everyone who had come before them, had produced a bulb that could last around 2,500 hours. For a household that used their lights a few hours each evening, that meant a single bulb could last well over a year, sometimes much longer. It was reliable, it was getting cheaper to produce, and people were buying fewer and fewer of them. And that last part, for the companies making them, was a very serious problem. So in December of 1924, representatives from the most powerful light bulb manufacturers in the world quietly assembled. Among them were Osram from Germany, Philips from the Netherlands, and General Electric from the United States, along with several other major players from France, Hungary, and Britain. Together, these companies controlled the vast majority of the global light bulb market. What they formed that day was called the Phoebus Cartel, sounds named after Phoebus, the Greek personification of the sun, which is perhaps the most ironic name they could have chosen for an organization that was about to deliberately dim the lights. The agreement they reached was extraordinary in its calculated cynicism. These were not companies colluding simply to fix prices, though they did that too. What made the Phoebus Cartel historically significant and genuinely disturbing is that they collectively agreed to make their own product worse. Their engineers, who had spent years trying to make bulbs last longer, were now instructed to do the opposite. The target they set was precise. No light bulbs sold by any member of the cartel should last more than 1,000 hours. If a manufacturer's bulbs were found to be lasting longer than that, they were fined. There were actual penalty systems in place, documented and enforced to ensure that the deliberate degradation of the product was being properly maintained. Think about that for a moment. Scientists and engineers, people who had dedicated their professional lives to solving problems, were now being paid to quietly reintroduce problems that had already been solved. They had to work backwards from progress. They had to find ways to make something they knew how to build well, worse, consistently, and without it being obvious to the person buying it. And they succeeded. Across the world, without any public announcement, without any government approval, The average lifespan of a light bulb dropped from around 2,500 hours to right around 1,000, just as the cartel had ordered. This is generally considered one of the earliest and clearest examples of what we now call planned obsolescence, the practice of deliberately designing a product to fail or become outdated sooner than it otherwise would, in order to keep consumers buying replacements. It is a concept that, once you understand it, you begin to see traces of almost everywhere in modern consumer culture. But the Phoebus cartel didn't stumble into it as a side effect of something else. They invented it consciously, systematically, and with considerable sophistication. The cartel also divided the global market among its members, essentially deciding which company got to sell bulbs in which part of the world. It was a tidy arrangement, insulated from competition, reinforced by financial penalties for anyone who stepped out of line. For roughly 2 decades, it functioned more or less as intended, and then the war came, and after it, things began to unravel. Documents relating to the Phoebus cartel began surfacing more seriously in the years following World War II, partly through investigations into corporate conduct, and partly through the kind of archival exposure that tends to happen when political and economic systems are upended. Historians and journalists pieced together what had happened, and the picture that emerged was damning. The cartel had not been a rumor or a conspiracy theory. It had been a real, documented, contractual agreement to defraud consumers across multiple continents for the benefit of a small group of very powerful companies. The cartel itself had already begun to fracture before the war ended, disrupted by shifting political alliances and the chaos of the conflict. But its legacy did not disappear. The concept it had pioneered, building things to break, designing for dependency, treating the customer not as someone to serve, but as a resource to be managed. That concept survived and spread into other industries in the decades that followed. There is a detail that tends to stay with people when they first hear about the Phoebus cartel. Somewhere in the world, in a fire station in Livermore, California, there is a light bulb that has been burning more or less continuously since around 1901. It is known as the Centennial Bulb, and it is watched over with something close to reverence, its glow documented by a small webcam that anyone can check on. It is, by all accounts, a bulb made before the cartel existed, before anyone decided that lasting too long was a flaw rather than an achievement. It glows on quietly, while somewhere in a storage room, a box of bulbs engineered to fail is waiting to be replaced. Chapter 7. Contemporary Evolution and the Fall of Incandescence. By the middle of the 20th century, the tungsten light bulb had become so ordinary, so deeply woven into the fabric of daily life, that most people had stopped thinking about it altogether. It sat in its socket, glowed when you flipped the switch, and burned out every year or so, just as the Phoebus cartel had quietly arranged. But the world around it was changing, and the pressures building on the outside, economic, political, and scientific, would eventually force the light bulb to evolve once more, or be left behind entirely. The fluorescent lamp had actually been around longer than most people realize. Scientists had been experimenting with gas discharge lighting since the late 1800s, and by the 1930s, General Electric and Westinghouse had developed versions practical enough to install in large spaces. But it was the Second World War that pushed fluorescent lighting into the mainstream. Factories running around the clock to produce weapons, aircraft, and supplies needed light that was cheaper to operate and generated less heat than incandescent bulbs. Fluorescent tubes consumed roughly a third of the energy for the same amount of brightness. And in a time when every resource was being rationed and every dollar counted, that difference mattered enormously. Government buildings, military installations, hospitals, and eventually offices adopted fluorescent lighting almost wholesale during those years, and they never really looked back. Then, in the 1970s, another crisis pushed the conversation further. The oil shocks of 1973 and 1979 sent energy prices soaring across the Western world, and suddenly ordinary households were being asked to think carefully about how much electricity they were consuming. The incandescent bulb, already decades old in its basic design, started looking like an extravagance. Engineers at Philips developed the first compact fluorescent lamp, the CFL, in the late 1970s, a curled or folded tube small enough to fit into a standard lamp socket. It was an awkward-looking thing at first, and expensive, and it took a while to warm up to full brightness. But it used about 75% less energy than an incandescent bulb and lasted many times longer. Slowly, reluctantly, it found its way into homes around the world. Still, for all its efficiency, the fluorescent lamp never felt quite right to many people. The light it produced had a cool, slightly clinical quality that many found unflattering or simply unpleasant after a lifetime under the warm glow of incandescent bulbs. It flickered imperceptibly in ways that gave some people headaches. It contained small amounts of mercury, which made disposal complicated. It was better in the narrow sense of consuming less power, but it was not loved. And so the search continued. Quietly, in university laboratories and corporate research centers, for something that could do everything the fluorescent did, and do it more beautifully. The answer was already theoretically visible by the 1960s. Scientists understood that certain semiconductor materials, when electricity passed through them, would emit light. This was the principle behind the light-emitting diode, the LED. Early versions appeared in the early 1960s, and they worked, producing a clean, efficient light that lasted practically forever, compared to anything that came before. The problem was that they only came in red and infrared. Then green followed. But without blue, there was no way to combine the three primary colors of light to produce white. And without white light, LEDs were limited to indicator lights on electronics and little else. Blue became the missing piece, the one gap that separated a curiosity from a revolution. And that gap turned out to be extraordinarily difficult to close. For decades, researchers tried and failed to produce a practical blue LED. The material most promising for the task was gallium nitride, but growing high-quality crystals of it was technically brutal, and the scientific consensus at various points drifted toward the conclusion that it might simply not be possible to make it work efficiently. Many well-funded research programs were quietly abandoned, but 3 scientists in Japan refused to give up. Isamu Akasaki and Hiroshi Amano, working together at Nagoya University, made critical breakthroughs in growing the necessary gallium nitride crystals through much of the 1980s. And Shuji Nakamura, working at a small chemical company called Nichia with comparatively modest resources, developed his own methods independently and managed in the early 1990s to produce a bright, practical blue LED. When the blue finally arrived, the white LED followed quickly, achieved by coating a blue LED with a phosphor that converted part of that blue light into a warm, broad-spectrum glow. In 2014, the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences awarded the Nobel Prize in Physics to all 3 men, recognizing that their work had, in the committee's own words, enabled bright and energy-saving white light sources that benefit mankind. It was a rare Nobel Prize, that most ordinary people, had they read about it, might have genuinely understood the significance of in their own daily lives. The LED light bulb that emerged from their work was, by almost every measure, the most efficient artificial light source ever made available to the general public. It consumed roughly 80 to 90% less energy than the old incandescent bulb. It lasted not 1,000 hours, not 2,000, but anywhere from 15,000 to 25,000 hours under normal use. It produced almost no heat. It could be manufactured in any color temperature, from the warm amber of candlelight to the cool blue-white of a clear noon sky. And as production scaled up through the 2000s and 2010s, the price dropped so quickly that it became genuinely affordable for most households in the developed world. Governments had already begun acting even before the LED fully matured. Australia moved first, announcing in 2007 a plan to phase out incandescent bulbs entirely. The European Union followed, beginning a staged ban in 2009 that would eventually remove them from store shelves across the continent. Brazil, the United States, Canada, and many others announced their own timelines for phasing them out. The reasoning was stark and arithmetically simple. The incandescent bulb converted roughly 10% of the energy it consumed into visible light, and the remaining 90% into heat. In a world beginning to grapple seriously with energy consumption and climate, that ratio was simply no longer defensible. And so, the object that had defined artificial light for more than a century, the warm glowing orb that had sat in every kitchen, every bedroom, every office since the days of Edison and Swan, quietly disappeared from the shelves. Not with any great ceremony, not with much public mourning, it was there. And then one day you went to replace a burned-out bulb and found only unfamiliar spiral tubes and slim LED alternatives where the old familiar shapes used to be. An era had ended, not with a dramatic moment, but with a slow fading, which is perhaps a fitting way for a light to go out. Chapter 8. The Hidden Impact. There is a detail about human sleep that most people have never heard, and once you learn it, it becomes difficult to ignore. Before the widespread use of artificial light, people did not sleep the way we sleep today. They did not lie down at night and wake up 8 hours later in one continuous stretch. Instead, they slept in two separate phases, divided by a quiet hour or two of wakefulness in the middle of the night. Historians and sleep researchers have found references to this pattern scattered across centuries of diaries, medical texts, and literature. The French called it le premier sommeil, the first sleep. After waking naturally around midnight, people would pray, read by candlelight, talk softly with a spouse, or simply lie in the darkness and think. Then they would drift back into what was called the second sleep until morning. This was not insomnia. This was the natural architecture of human rest, shaped over thousands of years by the rhythm of darkness and firelight. The body would fall into deep sleep shortly after sundown, rise gently into a lighter state around midnight, rest again, and greet the dawn. It was a relationship with the night that was intimate and unhurried. The darkness was not an obstacle. It was a companion. The light bulb ended all of that, slowly and without announcement. As gas lamps and then electric light began pushing back the edges of the evening, the first sleep stretched longer and longer. The hour of quiet wakefulness in the middle of the night became unnecessary, then forgotten, then completely erased from cultural memory. Within a generation or two, people stopped remembering that it had ever existed. And with it went something harder to name, a certain quality of stillness that the pre-electric night had always contained. What replaced it was not simply a longer sleep. What replaced it was a disrupted one. Our bodies still carry the biological memory of that older rhythm. Melatonin, the hormone that signals darkness and prepares us for rest, is suppressed by light, particularly by the blue wavelengths that electric bulbs and later screens produce in abundance. When we expose ourselves to artificial light well into the evening, we delay the body's natural preparation for sleep without even noticing. The circadian rhythm, that ancient internal clock calibrated over millennia to the movement of the sun, began to drift out of alignment with the actual hours of the day. Sleep disorders, which were rare enough before the industrial era to barely warrant serious medical attention, gradually became one of the defining conditions of modern life. And beyond sleep, the light bulb reshaped what the night was allowed to be. Before electric light, darkness enforced a kind of democratic rest. Rich or poor, urban or rural, the absence of affordable light after a certain hour meant that most of human activity slowed and then stopped. Taverns closed, workshops went dark, streets emptied. The night belonged to a small minority who could afford enough candles or oil to push through it, and even they faced limits. But once electricity arrived and the cost of light collapsed, the night became available to everyone, and industry moved quickly to claim it. The factory, which had already transformed the countryside during the Industrial Revolution, now extended its reach into the hours that had always been protected by darkness. Night shifts appeared. Workers who had once organized their lives around the rhythm of daylight found themselves feeding machines at 2 a.m. under the steady hum of the electric lamps. The idea of the 24-hour economy, which we now accept without question, was not a natural evolution. It was a deliberate choice made possible by a single invention. The body was never consulted. And from that same invention came the nightlife that cities began to celebrate with such enthusiasm. Restaurants that stayed open past midnight, music halls and theaters running late performances, the illuminated street as a space of leisure and spectacle rather than danger and silence. There is something genuinely beautiful about all of it. The warmth of a lit cafe window on a cold evening, the glow of a city seen from a distance. The light bulb gave us that. It gave us the feeling that the world does not have to end when the sun goes down. But it also gave us something we are still struggling to name properly. A kind of restlessness, an inability to be fully still. When darkness is no longer allowed to mean anything, when every hour of the night can be made to look like noon if we choose, something in the human experience loses its texture. The contrast disappears. We became creatures without a true night, and in doing so, we lost the particular quality of thought and feeling that only comes in real darkness, in the quiet space between one sleep and another. There is a certain irony buried in the history of the light bulb. It was invented at every stage as a solution to a problem. The problem of dangerous candles, the problem of expensive oil, the problem of gas explosions and soot-stained walls. Every inventor from Davy to Edison to the engineers who followed them was trying to make life safer and more comfortable and more productive. And they succeeded, more completely than any of them could have imagined. The light bulb is one of the most successful objects ever created, but solutions have a way of introducing their own problems, quietly, over time, in ways that are only visible from a distance. The light bulb did not just illuminate rooms, it illuminated factories through the night, and hospitals and offices and bedrooms where people lie awake wondering why they cannot sleep. It rewrote the human relationship with time so thoroughly that we have almost entirely forgotten there was ever a different relationship to rewrite. We live in the world the light bulb made. And as you close your eyes tonight, in whatever quiet corner you have found for yourself, perhaps there is something gently worth remembering. That the darkness you are settling into is not empty. It is old. It has been with us far longer than the light, and for a few hours at least, it is entirely yours.